When I was in seminary, I had to read this book cover to cover. Today, I do not recommend that professors require students to do this. And this video will talk about why, but why you still need a copy of this book. Let's get into it. Hi, I'm Daryl Billing from Biblical Mastery Academy. In this video, we're going to talk about Greek grammar beyond the basics, the classic intermediate Greek grammar written probably in the last 35, 40 years of pretty much all of the Greek grammars. There's a lot of Greek grammars around and there's some really good ones, but this is probably the classic grammar that I reckon every Greek student has either heard of or is about to hear of and probably needs to get a copy of at some point. I would put this really up there with something like BDAG or even your Greek New Testament. It's that important. This is a very good grammar and one which I recommend you have. And Dan Wallace's story behind this is actually really interesting. He wrote this book, then he had an accident which affected his memory and he had to relearn Greek. And to do that, he went back to his grammar, back to his old notes and relearned all the intermediate Greek from scratch. Since then, he's gone on to do a number of different things, including most recently and most famously perhaps, the creation and development and running of the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts. But before all that happened, this grammar was the grammar that really put Dan Wallace on the map. And like I said, if you've been around biblical Greek for any length of time, you've probably come across this grammar. And if you have, hit the like button to make sure other people find this video. And in fact, if you've been around this channel for any length of time, also hit the like button to help other people find out more about why they need to get a copy of this grammar. Now, I don't get paid to promote this grammar, although I do have some affiliate links below if you want to get a copy on Amazon or on Logos Bible Software, which is where I recommend you get a copy of this grammar. So go ahead and click those if you need a copy of this. But I'm assuming that probably most of you already have a copy of this if you've been doing Greek for any length of time. So let's get into the good and the bad of this grammar and why I don't recommend. Let's start with why I don't recommend that if you're a professor, you have your students read through it. Like I said, when I went through second year Greek, I was required to read this book from cover to cover. Now I had colleagues who took the same class with different professors in the same seminary who had to read it twice, once per semester. And I don't recommend that either. This is a really good grammar, but it's not really a reader's grammar. And there are a number of reasons for that. I mean, there's nothing particularly wrong with using it as a classroom grammar, but I just think that there are better grammars out there for classroom use, including, for instance, Greek, going deeper with New Testament Greek, which you'll find a link to my review of that just up here in the top corner. So go click that if you're interested in a grammar that is better, very much like Wallace's Greek Grammar Beyond the Basics, but isn't quite as, is a little bit better for a classroom grammar. So this one though is not suited for a classroom grammar, and one of the main reasons for that is it's just overly detailed. Now here's the thing. When people come to Greek and you're coming into Greek exegesis to understand how the syntax and the grammar of the language works, so you can do in-depth Bible study in the original language, which is why you learn the language, right? So you can do in-depth Bible study. Then this grammar has just got way too much in it. I mean, most students are struggling with terms like adjectival and adverbial, and when you use those things with a genitive as adjectival or as adverbial, that's about the level of detail that a lot of second year students can grasp. And so to learn that you've got comparative genitives and you've got ablatival genitives and you've got objective and subjective genitives and so on and so forth ends up making this quite detailed. Now, every grammar is going to have a number of those categories, but let's say, for instance, with this one, with the genitive, well, Wallace gives you about 33, I kid you not, 33 different categories of the genitive. And if you're going to quiz your students on that, well, you should be expecting a pretty high failure rate because A, most of them won't remember, and B, even if they do, they're not going to remember what they're for and how to distinguish between them. So it just gets to a point where there's too much detail and a student just can't take it in and can't recall it all. Now that's not to say that the categories that he gives us for the genitive are completely invalid. They are really well defended and argued for. For instance, the genitive of production versus a genitive of producer. Two interesting and finely tuned categories, but which I think, as you read through this, make good sense as you read his descriptions for it. And so it's not to say I'm not saying there's a place for those categories, but I am saying that if you're a student, you probably don't want to be encumbered with that level of detail. And so this is probably not where I would go to learn the basics of a genitive or dative or anything like that during second year. In fact, I would probably say this is way too detailed for second year, classroom use. And not only that, it's actually acknowledged really by the publisher that this is too long. And there's two ways the publisher acknowledges that. First of all, there's an abridged version of this that you can get, which is much simpler, which is probably a far better classroom grammar than requiring something like this. And if you're interested in using something like this as a classroom grammar, well, check that out. I'll leave a link in the description below so you can go grab a copy of the abridged version of that as well. The other way the publisher recognizes that this is probably too long is by putting arrows next to many of the genitive and other categories as well to say these are the ones you really want to focus on. And it's really to say students really need to know these ones, but they are, they're common. That's the key thing. And so, those are probably sufficient really for most students. And so why encumber them with all the other ones? So those are really two ways that the publisher themselves actually argues this is perhaps too long for a classroom grammar. Now, another reason that this is not a great classroom grammar is because of the sheer number of illustrations. Sometimes there are way more illustrations, and part of this is because there's so many categories to start with, but there are so many illustrations that it just takes such a long time for a student to actually work through them, especially when their Greek is not that good to start with. And so it becomes really time consuming to read through those illustrations and explanations and really take it in. And so it's just a little bit too much, and I think a shorter grammar would allow the student to grasp more of the language without being encumbered with all of those details. So if you're a professor, I do not recommend that you require this of your students as a reading grammar, though I reckon that you should recommend every single student who's in second year or higher get a copy of this. Just like you'll be recommending BDAG, you want to be recommending this grammar at the same time, especially if they're serious about studying the Bible. And there's three reasons why I still recommend that you encourage students, and you as a student should consider purchasing and copying of this grammar. The first one is that if you want to really understand something with exegetical significance, and from an exegetical perspective, this grammar has very clear explanations and descriptions of all of those grammatical categories. This is really most helpful when you realize that you're looking at a passage and you're asking yourself, well, how is this actually working here? And you're at that moment, you've got those questions in your mind and you're wanting the detail. That's when this grammar is ideal, because it's going to give you very clear discussions, very clear explanations, and then it's going to give you a good number of answers and examples, as well as the discussion about what it is and what it looks like and so on and so forth. In fact, it may even have the exact verse you're looking for in the scripture index, in which case you can find where they discuss this particular verse, or grammatical construction you might even be looking at in the book. And there are many times where you have verses with 5, 6, 7 different references inside this grammar, which means that if you're looking at the passage and you're wondering about how something is working, there's a good chance that it's going to be covered in here. Now, it doesn't cover everything, obviously, because you just can't do that. But nonetheless, this has got very good explanations of grammatical categories, exegetical concerns that you're going to be interested in. And so this is a place you're going to want to go regularly, especially when you have questions about, well, how is this working? Because when you're in that mode where you're wondering, how is this working? You want something that's going to give you good, clear answers and good examples. And that's where this grammar really shines. And like I mentioned, the second reason really to get a copy of this is that it's got so many examples in it. And like I said, if you go to the scripture index and you look up the verse that you're looking at, there's a good chance you're going to find somewhere in here some reference, and you're going to find detailed exegetical discussions of the very passage that you're looking at, because it's got so many examples. And you'll see not only the explanation and the description of it, but often there's a little discussion about the different perspectives on a particular passage, and particularly ones where there is a lot of debate and argument between different scholars, be it in journals or be it in commentaries. You're going to have a good discussion from a grammatical perspective in those cases. That doesn't mean you're going to have to agree with everything he says, but if you want a grammatical discussion, well, that's going to be often found in this grammar, and even superseding the discussions you find in commentaries quite often. And this also gives you an opportunity then to learn how to interact with different views and how to do so in a way that is simple, sincere, desiring to know and understand, but yet without some of the bombast and heat that sometimes surrounds some of these grammatical discussions. And that leads me to the third reason you really want to have a copy of this grammar on your shelf. There are times when you're going to find two different commentaries, like exegetical commentaries with two different views on, say, how a genitive or a dative or a participle or whatever it is functioning. And when you find those two views, quite often you can look at it in here and you'll be able to see the two positions that the people take and understand them with clarity because the explanations here are really good, and then evaluate based on the explanations and the examples that he gives you there, which of those two is going to be correct. So this is going to give you really a lot that you're going to need to evaluate grammatical arguments with clarity and depth in a way that really no other modern grammar will allow you to do. So again, I recommend if you don't have a copy of this on your shelf or in your Logos collection, go grab a copy. You'll find the links below, and you want to use this and refer to it pretty regularly. And like I said, you can find verses that you're using, that you're working with in the scripture reference if you have the physical edition. You do have the scripture reference in the Logos edition as well. But also you can just do a search inside Logos for a reference and find it in here or in any other grammar. And if you're interested in more detail on that, find my video about how I use Logos and how I do such searches up in this video just up here as well. So if you've learnt Greek and you were introduced to intermediate Greek or second year Greek using this grammar, I'd love to hear from you. What did you think? Leave a message in the comment section below and tell me how you got on with it and what you think of this grammar and whether you think this is a good classroom grammar for second year, and if not, what you would recommend instead. Now I'm going to do another review in the near future on the grammar I recommend as an intermediate Greek grammar for classroom environments, so watch out for that in a few weeks or so. But for the moment, you still want to have a copy of this, and I always recommend that you get a copy for your library if you don't have a copy. This is probably the classic modern intermediate Greek grammar, and therefore, and it's well written, it's by a respected scholar, it's a little dated in some areas, but that really doesn't matter. This has got such a good way of thinking about the text, arguing through the different views, and such good detailed discussions, along with great examples, that you can't afford not to have it on your shelf. So you should have this. Get a link, get a copy using the links in the description below. And if you have seen this, don't forget to leave your comments in the comment section below. Love to hear from you down there. Now, we use this grammar in a lot of detail. In fact, you go through pretty much every element of this grammar in the Biblical Mastery Academy Greek Mastery membership. If you're interested in that and going in depth in your knowledge of Greek and how to study the scriptures, then we have courses for you inside there once you've finished beginning Greek. So if you're interested in going through and getting some detail and depth in Greek, then click this link just here to get your Biblical Languages Starter Pack and get started today. I look forward to serving you and being a blessing to you again in the future. In the meantime, keep taking small, consistent steps toward mastery, and I'll see you in the next video. See you then.